Hey guys, I am here for a video about mainstream media journalism. A few things have unfolded that really further emphasized what I've always said about Western journalists and really drives home the point that these people know exactly what they're doing. This isn't a matter of journalists being poor at their job. It is very much deliberate. I'm going to share a bunch of exchanges with you here, which I think will speak for itself. I will add some commentary, but this video will have a heavy focus on simply sharing the exchanges directly with you in its full context so that you can come to your own conclusions as well if you don't necessarily agree with mine. So this video will be content heavy, and you can look at it as a masterclass of the state of modern journalism and how it's infested with bad actors, propagandists, and state-sponsored, malicious state-sponsored narratives. And you know what? Actually, a mass expose or a self-help video might be a more appropriate word to use for this journey that we're about to take, because I'm going to try to focus on handing you these very revealing exchanges on a silver platter. I think it's going to be easy to see what's going on once I'm done here, but once again, you can see for yourself. I have a feeling this is going to be a bit long, so consider watching this video in sections if you find it too long. So, as some of my subscribers may know, the BBC reached out to me regarding a piece they were doing on foreign influencers quite a while back. It was clearly a hit piece on the people who had positive views on China or who challenged mainstream media narratives. But when I started to ask them some uncomfortable questions about BBC's dishonest coverage, with specific examples of misinformation, they decided to stay clear of me, and they just completely dropped me from their piece. They could have continued, covering me and just ignored my questions, but I suspect they didn't want the risk of their audience looking me up and seeing me pointing out the gaping holes and issues in the BBC's coverage. Well, the same thing has happened again, this time with New York Times. So, Paul Moser, an Asia tech reporter from the New York Times, reached out to me with the following message. Hey Daniel, this is Paul Moser with the New York Times. Wanted to reach out because we're working on an article about some of the pro-China influencers and the support they get from state media government. I wanted to make sure you have a fair chance for comment. We don't mention your channel in the article, but we do have a video clip in the story in which you say it's time to put Hong Kong first, and that entails cleaning up this rot. This is why Hong Kong's national security laws are being pushed through and why it has so much support. Let me know if you have any comment on that particular quote or more broadly about the topic. Cheers, Paul. Now, this was an amazing opportunity to be able to provide context, which included examples of things that happened in Hong Kong that the New York Times has wanted to downplay or hide from their audience. I could now introduce facts that have long been hidden from their audience, and even play on their yellow peril infection to really drive home my point. So my response was as follows. Sure thing, I'll expand on the rot comment. If the U.S. had been dealing with rioters throwing Molotov cocktails at police, knocking their teeth out, stabbing them in the necks, throwing acid at them, burning down shops, beating women in the streets, lighting people on fire, and killing people with bricks, all while Chinese Communist Party officials flew from Beijing to meet with and praise these protesters. Plus, on top of it all, you had American protest leaders flying over to Beijing to testify in front of the National People's Congress, asking for support and talking about containing America. But the U.S. had no national security laws or sufficient legal mechanisms to put a stop to this activity. I would also call this a rot and an issue that needed to be fixed. Well, that's exactly what happened, in reverse, with Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, Joshua Wong, and the rioters in the streets of Hong Kong. I hope this helps clarify my position. Thanks, Daniel. So, now at this point, I'm really curious, right? How are they going to take this out of context? I suspected, though, and I had told many people by this point, that they'd just totally drop me from the article to preserve the hard work that they put into hiding these details from the public. About a week later, I thought, while this article was pending, I had a greater chance of being able to question some of Paul and the New York Times work and actually get a response, compared to my chances if I were to wait until he was done with me. So I decided to follow up with the following message a week later. Hi, Paul. I know as you're in the process of investigating many pro-China YouTubers, you may be keeping an eye on our timelines and potentially will see my recent video/tweet calling today's mainstream media journalists every bit as disgusting as the journalists laughing at Bush joking about the WMD lies that they helped push, supporting operations that led to the death, destruction, and deaths, I meant to say displacement here, of many children. I apologize if you do see it and take offense, especially because I haven't seen if you've given us a fair shake in your final product. But I thought that because I have an open line of communication with you, I wondered if I'd be able to ask you one simple question that could lead me to begin reevaluating my conclusions about mainstream media employees. Now, at the end of this video, I will share you the tweets and videos that I was referring to when I said he might have seen my tweets. A warning, they are pretty graphic, but it really drives home the point as to why these journalists should be expected to do better, why they should reflect on how they act and how irresponsible it is that they don't reconcile the clearly BS-filled stories that they keep pushing today. So for now, I'll continue with my message to Paul. I go on to say, I noticed New York Times also pushed Tursunay Ziawadan's concentration camp story, either without doing any due diligence or while deciding it was unimportant to mention how many times her story has changed and or that her timeline is physically impossible, considering her passport was renewed by China while she was supposedly under arrest. I then told him that this was one of the things that I had asked the BBC journalists who wanted to write a piece on me, but later decided to drop me and keep their distance. So I continue and say, I tried to get a couple of BBC journalists to address this when they began communicating with me, especially since there was a petition with 4,000 signatures asking the BBC to provide an explanation on this story that they pushed. After asking them about this, not only did they ignore my question, they completely cut me out of their story, and they didn't want to have anything to do with me anymore. As you can imagine, this only reinforced my low opinion of mainstream media journalists and supported the idea that they exist more to preserve key important narratives than they do to uncover the truth. So, my question to you is this. Would you be willing to take on the curious case of Tursunay Ziawadan, or would you at least be willing to pass this on to someone at the New York Times who will? I'll be honest with you, as you can already imagine, I expect that you are unable to do this without risking your career and salary at best. Or worst, you're content with the way that your organization maliciously manipulates public opinion. Again, apologies for my frankness, but I've never wanted to be proven wrong as much as I do now. For the sake of humanity, I hope you can help me. Thanks for taking the time to read this. Now, Paul eventually responded and said, Hey, Daniel, thanks for the responses. I will get back to you on the article. Some stuff is in flux. It's interesting. We find out what was in flux afterwards. But once it clears up, I'll let you know if we need further comment. To your point about the article, we are not punished for passing on criticisms. If you feel strongly about it, feel free to write up your specific issues with our article and send it along. I will make sure it gets to the reporter and editor who worked on it. I do note that we are not the BBC, so I can't answer questions about issues in their article. If you do write down your objections, I would encourage you to cite sources/links, as that's helpful for us to follow up on. Hope that's helpful. We'll be in touch. So I responded with, sure thing, here is the article with Tursunay Ziawadan's story. Her original story on BuzzFeed went from, to be honest, it wasn't that bad, and we had our phones, we had meals in the canteens. Other than being forced to stay there, everything was fine. This was on BuzzFeed in early 2020. Her story has evolved multiple times and also includes a critical hole where her passport was renewed while she was apparently under arrest, which is, of course, impossible. After her story was gradually upgraded to its current version, she managed to obtain some sort of legal status to relocate to the U.S., where she regularly participates in U.S. government-sponsored panel. Might be an interesting conflict of interest story for you in the other direction. If your statement is true and there is no risk to your paycheck if you report the truth, then this journalist is either incompetent at doing due diligence or deliberately withheld these critical flaws in Tursunay's story from the public. It would be great to learn which it is. I really appreciate you looking into this. It's far more than I got from the BBC already. I then decided to use this as an opportunity to ask about Paul's work more specifically that he wouldn't necessarily be able to deflect off of. Now, of course, by this point, I did a quick scan of his work and I saw that he pretty much, like every other cookie-cutter Western mainstream media journalist covering China, kind of said the exact same things. But nonetheless, I went on to ask him, I appreciate that you're going through an effort to clarify an issue that doesn't involve you personally, instead, only your organization. If it's not too much of an imposition, I would like to ask you about your coverage. I know you've covered China for a while, commented frequently on Hong Kong, and are even now asking me about Hong Kong. While I still hope you're able to get me an answer for the Tursunay issue from your organization, perhaps asking you a Hong Kong-related question in the meantime would be more personally relevant to you, and you'd be able to answer without having to reach out to anyone else. I'm wondering if you have ever written about any of the following major stories or events that happened during the Hong Kong protests. And if you didn't, was it because you didn't know these things were happening? Covering it wouldn't go over well? Or you didn't feel the need to share any of this with your audience? My apologies. Although the list will be incomplete, it's still going to be very long, just to make sure I can identify at least a handful of items that any balanced coverage of Hong Kong would have included. So now I go on to list. 70-year-old street cleaner killed by protesters by throwing a brick. 57-year-old construction worker burned alive. Mainland journalist that was tied up and beaten by a Hong Kong mob at the airport. Taiwanese journalist who escaped a beatdown by continually yelling that they were from Taiwan and not the mainland. Hong Kong police officer stabbed in the neck. Hong Kong officer having his teeth knocked out. Hong Kong officer mutilated in an office attack. 53-year-old man suffering major head injuries after being hit with a drain cover for cleaning protester barricades. Politician being stabbed in the chest. Pro-establishment politician offices being burned down. Violence towards ordinary civilians, especially women. Massive weapons factory at Chinese University with 8,000 Molotov cocktails discovered. Mainland Chinese students being evacuated from campuses due to concerns targeted violence towards them. JP Morgan being punched in the face after saying we are all Chinese, and Joshua Wong refusing to condemn it, calling it a trial and error process. Taxi driver having his face beaten into a bloody pulp. Hong Kong officers being provided with rape alarms to hand out to their children because of threats towards their families. Buses with young school children having near misses with Molotov cocktails on the day that protesters used violence and force to get locals to comply with their citywide strike mandate. Steve Bannon showing up on live streams with Guo Wengwei, remotely giving instructions to protesters on the ground. Any perspectives from pro-establishment, pro-Beijing Hong Kongers represented in an honest way. Whew, thank you once again, Paul. Daniel. I know that's a lot of stuff, but I really wanted to, just one of them, even if he could just tell me one of them. Actually, yeah, I did write about this. I don't think he wrote about any of them. I'd be surprised if there was a handful. But anyways, I didn't hear back from him. And after a while, I decided to ask Amy Qin publicly. That's the person who was responsible for pushing Tursunay's story on the New York Times. And I wanted to just reach out to her directly. So I tweeted, "Hi, Amy Qin. I didn't hear back from your colleague. I guess you must all be busy. Do you mind if I ask you directly? Did you either A, not do any due diligence on Tursunay, B, knew about these critical holes, flaws, but didn't inform your readers? I've attached the following video to illustrate my point and issue more clearly." And here's the video I attached.
They actually cried. These are not actors. They have no...
Yeah, I mean, Tursunay, the most famous person who's crying in these witness testimonies is Tursunay Ziawaden. She was first, so her first interview was with BuzzFeed. And her first interview with BuzzFeed, she said she didn't experience any physical abuse, and it was actually all right overall. They still had their phone. They were eating in the canteen. She then upgraded her story to say that she was beaten, raped, she witnessed all these things, and then she got a spot on BBC. The problem was when they showed her passport and they actually, you listened to her story, it conflicts with each other. Her passport was renewed while she was apparently in these concentration camps. 4,000 people signed a petition to get BBC to answer why they uncritically pushed this story. They never answered it. CNN then re-aired it, but when CNN re-aired it, they blurred out her passport renewal date because it was a giant hole in her story. So first of all, she left China legally through exit immigration. She had her passport renewed while she was apparently in the concentration camps, and her story has changed 3 times. This is the number one witness testimony, and she's being carted around similar to how Naira, with the fake testimony of the 14-year-old girl crying on stage saying that there were babies being thrown from incubators by Iraqi soldiers, similar kind of a thing. Would you say that that's a massive red flag we've got going on here?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, most Uyghurs have had their passports confiscated.
So she didn't have her passport confiscated. She had it renewed. She had a visa to exit the country.
In prison, she renewed her visa. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what she's saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. So this is exactly what I want. So if you find that she said her passport renewal date on her passport that she provided shows that her passport was renewed during the period of time that she said she was under arrest, would you still say it's her story, not my story? Impossible. Something's wrong with that story. I think we're agreeing here.
If you're right, it's one person.
After about 3 weeks passed since my last message to Paul, I decided to follow up again. By this time, I had a very clear understanding of exactly how appallingly unbalanced and out of context his work was. So I wrote to Paul, "Hi, Paul. I know you must be busy, and the length of my last message might have been a bit overwhelmingly long, so I decided to check out your tweets/coverage of Hong Kong and China on my own. The only 2 curiosity questions I'm now left with, if you don't mind my asking, related to your work are, 1, are you mandated or forced or incentivized to cover events in a specific way, or your Hong Kong and China related coverage/framing is entirely of your own free will and choice, uninfluenced by incentive? 2, would you personally characterize your own and your organization's coverage of China-related topics to be fair and balanced? And one final question regarding the old Tursunay inquiry. Did you receive any feedback on whether your colleagues failed to do any due diligence on Tursunay's story, or if the team was aware of the holes in her story but decided not to inform her readers, or instead have your colleagues refused to respond to you? In the interest of transparency and full disclosure, your earlier responses and pending responses might be used in a video, but if you wish to answer any of these new questions off the record, please let me know beforehand and I will respect that. I'm genuinely interested in wrapping my mind around what's really going on here. And if to gain access to that information I must keep your answers confidential, I will comply. It may guide my future investigations into the state of mainstream media, but I will keep your detailed responses confidential if you wish. I will publish this response, but future sharing will be halted if you so require. I didn't receive a response, and Paul's article was published without me included. They dropped me, just as I expected. So I had kept Paul anonymous up until this point when I was sharing my exchanges with him, but since the article was out and open with his name on it, I decided to ask a very specific question related to my curiosity about whether they're satisfied with the level of balance presented in their reporting. And what better way to do this than take a specific example from this new article that I was supposed to be included in. It couldn't get any better than illustrating the issue with their dishonest and biased reporting by using this fresh, new example of what they'd like to refer to as investigative journalism. So I tweeted out, "Public question, Paul Moser. As New York Times often does, you mentioned allegations against Nike. New York Times mentioned Skechers once, in the past I meant to say, but refused to publish their response, instead quietly excluding them, never once including it. Do you feel that this is fair/balanced? Are you prohibited from reporting this?" Now, the attached images included in my tweet contained a screenshot of their new article, mentioning the allegations against Nike, H&M, and other brands. The next image showed that they have mentioned Nike in their Xinjiang-related reporting many times over the past year. The next image shows that they only mentioned Skechers once, back before Skechers had an official response and before they did their independent investigation. And the final image shows Skechers' final official response, where they clearly state their investigations uncovered nothing that supported the allegations against the implicated factories. This was ignored by the New York Times, and they simply became disinterested in Skechers after this response came out. Because not only does it not support their narrative, it hurts it. And this is exactly why they couldn't publish my answer either. I guess you're already starting to notice a trend here. So shortly after, I realized that his article was suspiciously timed very closely to an ASPI report on the exact same topic. Now, ASPI is a think tank that's funded by weapons manufacturer and the U.S. government. Now, I was actually included in this ASPI piece. They didn't drop me from their side. But it's still a bit ironic, isn't it? Paul's whole article was on trying to find patterns and connections with government agencies and speculating on funding and conflicts of interest, while this interesting coincidence appears between him and this nefarious organization. If this topic interests Paul, it appears he could probably start with examining his body of work, and it'd tell a far more interesting story. Or is that the whole point here? And this is just a giant piece of projection. Now, ASPI has actually been exposed for working very closely with media and shaping their stories without ever clearly and honestly disclosing this either. In an embarrassing slip-up, when ASPI's Uyghur for Sale report came out on February 28th, 2020, it referred to a Washington Post article that hadn't even come out yet and only went public on the 29th. Now, this was probably a slip-up and an internal miscommunication that didn't take into consideration the time zone differences. ASPI is in Australia a day earlier than the US, and they were probably meant to publish it on the same day. Neither Washington Post or ASPI, neither in Washington Post article or ASPI's report, did they mention that it was a collaboration, or even, and actually they even went as far as referencing each other in such a way to make it look like two completely independent pieces of work from each side. Now, Vicky Hsu was caught casually mentioning that it was a collaboration elsewhere afterwards, especially. But finally, they decided that the best way to do damage control here was to cover it up with fraud. The first report accurately showed that the report was published on February 2020. But then they quietly deleted that and updated their report to falsely state that it was first published on March 1st, 2020, in order to appear like it came out after the Washington Post article. I mean, this is important. It shows the dishonest and untransparent relationship that ASPI has with media outlets. So in light of this, I quote tweeted my original public question to Paul under his new tweet promoting his article where he referred to the subjects of his scrutiny, new-aged useful idiots, now referred to as useful influencers, and said, "Hey, Paul, using your methodology, considering the suspicious timing of your and State Department-funded articles, further considering that you don't ever present the full story, are you a useful influencer for the other side, or just a journalist in need of improving?" Paul has so far neglected to comment or reply on any of these outstanding items, and the same goes for Amy Qin. When we were duped into believing various stories like Nira's fake testimony in the 90s, the human life cost, the number of people that suffered, the number of people who died or who were displaced, made possible in part by the failure of journalists to do their jobs, should have been a wake-up call. They should have been able to look this Tursunay story example right in the face and say, guys, we're screwing up here again. Now, the issues, of course, go way beyond just Tursunay. This is just one story, but the inability or lack of desire these journalists have to address this issue, their willingness to put something like this out and either ignore or fail to spot the red flags, paints a far bigger and more concerning picture. I'm convinced these people are blatant propagandists, but even if you want to give them the benefit of the doubt, and you want to say maybe they just don't see the big deal with this one single issue, their unwillingness to reconcile or cover this story not only shows a bias, because you can be sure if flaws like this were appearing in a story on the other side, they'd be all over it. But certainly if they're willing to ignore such a big issue like this, after they've actively promoted it, you get a sense as to why they miss all the less obvious issues with the overall narrative, and why they're unable to see any nuance in any of these narratives. Arslan killing was an excellent example of this also, but I finally managed to pressure her into responding, and it really shows why most of these journalists will try their hardest to keep their mouth shut about this issue unless they're really backed into a corner. So she is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who I've had discussions with before, and before I talk about those discussions, I'll mention why Arslan showed up on my radar again. It's because she boosted ASPI's report, which did include me, and her tweet said, "Search for Xinjiang on YouTube and you'll quickly find videos by Western influencers denying the atrocities that are taking place there. Great thread and report on this government-backed propaganda effort." I responded to her by saying, "I enjoyed our previous exchange and I wish to remain cordial with you, so I hope this doesn't come across as rude, but to be frank, I think from your position, you should be careful about too intensely criticizing people perceived as denying facts/issues. I attached our old conversation from back in July where she ended it short after I asked her about Tursunay's story. Arslan, despite trying to distance herself from Tursunay and suggesting she had nothing to do with it, did show up alongside her in her own report from August 2020, and she remained committed to Tursunay's story even as it changed and evolved, retweeting her update in February 2021, without any suspicion surrounding how the story was changing or how it didn't even make logical sense. Arslan responded to my new tweet by totally ignoring the Tursunay issue once again, and instead asking me a question. "I'm curious, what do you have to say about what ASPI said about you in their report?" The ASPI report was pretty shallow. I'll get into what they said in a bit, but I decided that I would entertain her question in the hope that it would cause her to reciprocate and finally answer my questions. So I said, "Attached is one response/reaction, but if there's a specific question, I'm happy to answer it if it's from you. May I also ask, what are your thoughts on not being able to get anyone to reconcile, including you, the story/the work done to promote Tursunay?" In this tweet, I had screenshot one of my earlier reaction tweets to ASPI's report, which said, "The opportunity to have our names marked down in history as disliked/attacked by a military-industrial complex-funded think tank is an honor of epic proportions. I just feel sorry for the poor sods that'll be remembered as the authors behind this shallow and desperate report." Or these are desperate reports, rather. A few days later, I followed up with the following reply. "Hi, Arslan. If unsatisfied with my answer, happy to elaborate, but I'd appreciate if you could also help me understand why everyone goes silent at this point. An unwillingness to confront such a major story hole raises doubt that truthful/honest narrative building is going on here." Now, I want to say, I really thought she would avoid answering at all costs. My previous main conversation with Arslan from a number of months ago was it involved a lot of stuff. It involved whitewashing the existence of the terrorist organization ETIM. No matter how many videos I shared with her, she kept saying, no, you know what, they're not really they don't really exist, or they're not really a big deal. Now, this is someone, keep in mind, who draws conclusions from satellite photos of Xinjiang, but the bar for required evidence apparently changes depending on the topic. Now, the next day, after pressure was mounting and many people were hoping to see an answer from Allison, most of whom Allison blocked preemptively, she began to respond. First, she started out with a little jab. Hi, Daniel. People stop talking to you around this point because instead of answering the question, you claim that ASPI just don't like you, or you make a counter accusation, or you change the subject entirely. So it feels difficult to have a conversation, and it takes lots of time. Well, now that's an odd one. Not only did I clearly answer her question about what I had to say about the ASPI report, I recognized that she may not like my answer and was looking for something different from her very ambiguous question, by the way. So I invited her to ask any other more specific questions that she may have. When I didn't hear back from her, I even followed up and told her if she was unsatisfied with my answer, I could elaborate. I answered every single question she's ever asked me and even invited her to ask more. It was only her who had ignored questions from months ago, yet I was being accused of not answering her questions and changing the subject. Very odd to say the least, but let's continue with her replies. As for Tursunay, we stand by our reporting. We can't really comment on others' works, but there are good reasons why she might have changed her story later, and her story is corroborated by what other former detainees have said separately. Just to clarify, once again, Tursunay did appear in Allison's work, and nobody reconciled these changes. She then says, regarding the point about her passport, which you rely on heavily, it's likely that it was printed sometime after she applied. I've had the same-day passport renewal before, but the standards process takes about 2 months. Quite likely it's the same here. So this is pretty remarkable and really shows how intellectually dishonest they're being here. I decided to reply with a summary of her position so that everyone could see this in black and white. Thanks for finally answering. I'll recap. 1. You use your UK passport renewal experience to speculate on/explain Chinese passport renewal stories. 2. You don't care to reconcile publishing and pushing Tursunay's ever-evolving story as there may or may not be a valid explanation. Next, you don't feel there's any urgency or need to reconcile Tursunay's story holes or even inform audiences that they exist. Next, you don't find it odd that the Chinese government renewed the passport of a Chinese concentration camp survivor on their deathbed. Next, all the while you can't think of any logical reason why Chinese government accounts would retweet perspectives like mine and are deeply curious about my explanation/reaction to what a U.S. government and weapons manufacturer think tank wrote about me. Thanks, and got it. I mean, keep in mind here, the ASPI report that I was included in was full of fluff. What they did was they simply showed that my tweets had been retweeted by Chinese media or government accounts on several occasions. Had they shown that American government officials or Western media was interested in my perspectives and retweeting them, that'd be something I'd be surprised about, particularly if any of my tweets related to Tursunay's story, a story that the West really wants you to believe, was included in those retweets. Putting that aside for a moment, as spectacularly ironic as Allison's curiosity is about my reaction to being retweeted by government accounts as reported by a think tank that is actually funded by the U.S. government, as spectacular as that is, there's something far more spectacularly ironic than that. Allison herself had her reporting funded by the U.S. government. Worse, it came from US AGM, more specifically, which is literally the U.S. government's foreign policy propaganda arm. This is the same report that she won a Pulitzer Prize for. I bet you don't think it can get any more comical than this, but this was done with BuzzFeed. Her report that she did here was done with BuzzFeed. The first installment of her report included Tursunay's upgraded testimony. Now, why is that spectacular? BuzzFeed is literally the same outlet that Tursunay's first version of her story was published on, which is wildly different than her current version. BuzzFeed has never reconciled this, and they're just kind of going along for the ride. I mean, at this point, can it be any more obvious, the level of dishonesty coming from these media outlets? I mean, one additional note on Allison killing. She appeared on a video with Arslan. He is the Xinjiang separatist who called himself an extremist in a video wishing for Allah to destroy the family members of Chinese public servants. And in a conversation with me, he admitted that he wanted to ethnically cleanse Xinjiang of non-Uyghurs. Arslan has also been caught multiple times pushing fake evidence and manipulated Douyin videos as genocide evidence. Now, I will say, in regards to the poor state of media, while Al Jazeera did go on to uncritically boost ASPI's report and wrote an article about it, the journalist responsible for that, John Power, while he didn't introduce any of the missing critical questions, he did reach out to me for comment. I never expected that he'd publish what I had to say, but credit where credit is due. Right at the end of his article, he put my response in its full and original context. And it said, if their position is that it's problematic, my content has been reshared by government officials, it helps further emphasize my point about ASPI, who not only has their reports reshared and utilized by government, who not only participates in government panels, but are funded by governments and the military-industrial complex to begin with, which is a significantly more problematic and conflict of interest-ridden issue. Recognizing this is a valuable first step to then examine and reconcile why many of their reports are dishonest, biased, and incomplete, because of course their sponsors being beneficiaries of the work that they sponsor is not just coincidental. I really wanted to write more, but I was worried that I'd give them too much room to take me out of context on. If I had the room to expand more without having to worry about being cut out of context, I would have said, and I wrote some of this out here, I would have said that I'm not really surprised that the Chinese government accounts have retweeted and reshared the perspectives that I have. And American government accounts haven't. When you look at the opposite side, you've got really disgraceful people like Matthew Tai, who was literally caught digging up graves in the Taiwan countryside and flicking the bones around for views. He was caught using a doctored Douyin video to present as genocide evidence. He's been caught red-handed fabricating a bogus escape from China story, who, because he's anti-China enough, was propped up by Radio Free Asia, a U.S. government-funded propaganda outlet with a far more nefarious history and global agenda than any Chinese media outlet. And this is from the same department that Alice Killing was funded by the way. He was even boosted by Paul Wolfowitz, a literal war criminal behind the war in Iraq. Matthew Tai has been caught over and over again pushing categorical lies. Not just disinformation, but outright blatant lies. Had I been doing the same, these articles written about me would have posted specific things I said. But because I don't peddle lies, and the truths of which I speak are inconvenient to Western media narratives, they don't want to include what I said, with the exception of this recent outlier. This is exactly why I was dropped from the New York Times article when they saw my explanation for the short, cut-out-of-context video they wanted to share of mine, which they probably searched for weeks to find and was devastated that it wasn't the gotcha they hoped it was. Do you think these journalists would be interested in reporting an actual disinformation agent / gravedigger like Matthew Tai? No, of course not. Some of them even follow Matthew Tai and are fans of his. So let's not try to pretend this is about good people versus bad people or truth versus lies, rather than just being about preferred narratives versus inconvenient ones. I've got a bit more of a detailed Twitter thread where I dig deeper into ASPI a bit more. I will share the link in the description. I think you'll be quite surprised when you see the kinds of things they engage in. What I'm going to do here now is I will just leave you with 2 short videos I made to post on Twitter. These videos will hopefully help convey my feelings and emotions surrounding why I think we should really expect more from our journalists and why I think we should be disgusted by them. Not only by the journalists you're about to see in the video who are laughing at the lies they helped push, which resulted in mass suffering, while undoubtedly, just like the journalists of today were pretending to care about right versus wrong, good versus evil, truth over lies, but you should still be equally disgusted, by today's journalists like Paul Moser, Amy Qin, Carrie Ellen, Sophie Williams, and the rest of them. Their code of conduct is no different than the journalists you'll hear laughing in the final 2 clips I'm going to share with you. They learned nothing from their failures. They're constantly acting and reporting with the same dishonest methods. And whatever future atrocities are caused under the guise of human rights with the help of these dishonest journalists, once again, I'm positive, just like before, they'll be ready to laugh it up afterwards again. A warning, once again, these clips are graphic and upsetting. The second clip is a variation of the first. There is no way to illustrate my deep emotional connection to this issue and my absolute disgust for mainstream media journalists without showing you these graphic images that are bad enough as it is, but still were selected from a library of images far worse than this. I'll leave you with those 2 clips, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died when in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it. We think the price is worth it. We think the price is worth it.
Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere. Nope, no weapons over there. Maybe under here. Nope, no weapons over there. Nope, no weapons over there.
Iraqi denials of supporting terrorism take their place alongside the other Iraqi denials of weapons of mass destruction. It is all a web of lies.
Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere.
When we confront a regime that harbors ambitions for regional domination, hides weapons of mass destruction, and provides haven and active support for terrorists,
Nope, no weapons over there. Maybe under here.